So good morning. So we're going to change scales and maybe objectives as well. So indeed, I'm leading the EJP SOIL that gathers 26, well, in fact, 45 research or higher education institutes in 24 European countries. So the idea was to be it's not fully, but quite representative of Europe. And what I would like to talk today about is monitoring soil health in the framework of the future soil health directive. So we have heard on Tuesday about this soil directive and focusing on lessons learned, on recommendations and lessons learned. So policy is only one of the levers for the agroecological transition, but still it is one of the levers. So it's probably different from the levers that were discussed this morning and maybe yesterday as well. And to protect a resource like soils, we do need to know in which state it is. So I'm convinced we do need to monitor soils, and these at different scales and for different objectives. And I will be more at the European and national objective. Okay. Well, I can make it classical way. So I think you had this slide on Tuesday from our colleague from GRC. So you know that in this project of the soil monitoring directive, it's focused on monitoring. So there's all section on objectives, definitions, monitoring and assessment. And to proceed, what is behind is, for example, defining what is the best sampling strategy, which indicators to use, how to set targets and thresholds, how to consider that something is good or bad for policy. Of course, I should have started with that. What do we talk about? What are we speaking about? Soil health, soil quality. And behind all that, behind all this effort, there's really a need that soil data becomes a common good. What are we talking about? So in the EJP SOIL, we try to differentiate actually soil quality and soil health. Maybe you have attended David Robinson's presentation. I'm looking forward to read his papers to deep digger into it. We considered, based on the literature, that soil quality was the capability of a given soil to provide ecosystem services. And this capability depends on the soil type, on the climate, on the land use. While soil health was its actual capacity. And the definition in the law is the actual capacity. They do not differentiate between soil quality and soil health. The actual capacity of even soil, at the moment where it is analyzed, where it is surveyed, where it is observed, to provide ecosystem services. And so we were not successful in convincing to use these two terms, but our idea behind was we think it's really important convey the idea that not all soils have the same potentialities. I don't mean that there's a good soil or a bad soil. It depends on what you want to do with it. But really to have that this idea is always there. And hence, not all soil has the same capabilities, but then they can be more or less degraded, soil health. And yes, I'm curious to know about your feedback on that. What we first did, as Morgan said, is that we did a lot of stock takes. What is the current state of affairs? And for example, look at the soil is de facto the reference regarding soil monitoring in Europe. But we surveyed which countries had already a national or regional soil monitoring systems. We found 19 countries had one already, extremely different in terms of the parameters being measured, of the frequency of the measurement, of the time sequence, extremely different also in the layout for grid versus mixed or versus stratified representative sites, different according to T-shirt. Okay. And one thing that came out of that is that the countries that already had a soil monitoring system do not want to top it. Of course, there's a legacy, there's a capital of information. So this puts this idea of monitoring at European scale of the soil monitoring law in other ways, that how to integrate what exists with Lucas and what exists in different countries. And then there's a question of harmonization, or how do you go from a data obtained in a given system to another one, so that we build on the capital we have, and we are lucky in a sense in Europe that we have quite much solid information already. So what we did regarding, so I said sampling strategy, indicators, targets, and thresholds. I will go through that. So we compared the results obtained with Lucas soil and with national soil monitoring systems. And we did that on 12 countries. And for example, we found that there's, of course, different spatial distribution of sites. What you have is national soil information system on the left and Lucas soil on the right. And the bluer, the darker it is, the more dense is the sampling density. You see, of course, it differs. For example, France has a grid layout. Lucas has a random stratified one. Okay, density. Maybe it doesn't matter. Yes, it does matter. It does matter in terms of representation of the land cover representativity. So this graph is a bit complex. What you have, the first two columns are Lucas soil and Lucas soil 22. Then results for the countries of the national soil monitoring system, and then the Lucas reference for land users. So not Lucas soil, but the Lucas reference. What you see is that there are differences, that in a number of cases, not all cases, but in several cases, the national soil monitoring system was approaching better the distribution of land users. And in other cases, Lucas soil was approaching better this distribution. The consequences is that it impacts soil types representativity. And here you have it compared to the distribution of soil types in the country for different soil types. And you see for Belgium, Germany, Denmark, and Estonia, that both Lucas and national soil monitoring systems differ. What we found, actually I should have said for land cover, is that Lucas soil, but to a lesser extent, national soil monitoring systems tend to overrepresent agricultural animal crops and agricultural land use, and Canby soils and Lucas soils are overrepresented. And these consequences on the soil properties distribution. And we found that there were significant differences in organic carbon, pH, and clay between these different systems. And one illustration is the soil organic carbon to clay ratio. This is one of the indicators proposed in the soil monitoring law. And you can see that, for example, for Italy, not much difference. This is Lucas, this is national monitoring system. For the Netherlands, wow, better to use the national system than the Lucas. It was actually the opposite for Belgium, which I did not represent here, and same for Poland. So it has practical consequences and political consequences in terms of use of the indicators. So the lessons learned for that are a need to better cooperate, try to cooperate between those networks to increase the accuracy of the soil data being monitored, and to develop on how to work on different data sets. Use scoring functions maybe to mix results from different systems and build transfer functions from one data set to another. And we have one policy brief on this topic. And we have started a double sampling exercise with Lucas to assess the role of analytical procedures. So same samples from Lucas, two samples from Lucas being analyzed at the national scale and by national labs and at the European scale. This is ongoing. And accounting for both the sampling and the analytical procedure by repeating the sampling with the national procedure. So this is ongoing. Yes, and of course, what we want to have is comparing the two. And the idea is to test the existing transfer functions for analytical methods, and then maybe to improve, to validate them or not, and to offer the possibility to improve transfer functions. That would be really a tool to integrate different monitoring systems. Regarding indicators, we went through the indicators proposed in the law, and you see where it's green. Well, indicators, they're very simple indicators in the monitoring law proposal, because it's really based, it's kind of pragmatic. What do countries already measure? What do countries already have in hand? Let's build on that. So my first reading of the law proposal, at first I was extremely disappointed, but then I came to think, okay, maybe it's good sometimes to be pragmatic and reduce ambitions. Let's build step by step. So far, there's no policy, general policy on salt. So that's the first objective. So you see, when it's green, we do agree on that. When it's orange, we partly disagree. For example, we analyze the distribution of the soil organic carbon to clay ratio and think that is so influenced by soil characteristics, in particular soil pH and clay content, that we recommend not to use it and rather use simply variations of soil organic carbon stocks. And in some cases, we think that variables should be added, for example, available water capacity, especially given the ongoing climate change, so infiltration rate, permeability, or the soil porosity, but these should be assessed. And regarding biological indicators, so we proposed, and the Parliament actually proposed the same thing, a tiered system. What was proposed initially was to measure respiration as an indicator of biodiversity. It is not an indicator of soil biodiversity. So we propose a set of indicators that are scientifically robust, for which there are norms. So its methodology is well assessed and it's relatively affordable. And to have, if possible, in the first tier, so that would be used by all countries, harmonized across all countries, if possible, all these indicators, or at least have one among the functional indicators and one among the structural indicators. So I'm curious, yesterday was a negotiation of the trilogue of the law, and I'm really curious to know what came out regarding biological indicators. Initially, yes, there was no biodiversity indicators. Only news I had this morning, because of course I asked it very rapidly to colleagues, is that went through apparently. So that's very good news. They came to an agreement between Parliament, European Commission, and the European Council. So now let's see what they retained. Also, what we suggested is to adapt the frequency, and it has to be accounted that not all parameters, not all indicators vary at the same speed. So maybe there's a need, given the cost, to adapt that. And 5 to 6 years seem a good compromise. To sample not only topsoil, but also subsoil, extremely important, for example, for soil compaction. And to really pay attention to the sampling period. Biodiversity should be sampled in spring or autumn. Not, of course, it's obvious, but obvious when you organize a sampling campaign at the national scale, these may come not as the first criteria. And be careful not to sample just after a management intervention, such as tillage or pesticide application. So what this requires, what this means is that there's contact between the samplers and the owner or the manager of the land. And this is actually not ensured in many cases. And the estimated cost was 1,000 to 2,050 euro per sampling, which may appear a lot if you multiply by, I don't know, 5,000 points in a country, and may appear quite reasonable if the outcome is to know in which status are our soils. Then selection of indicators, then setting targets and thresholds. So we did a work, well, with colleagues from Benchmarks and AI for Soil also, because to assess soil health, in a sense, you need to have an optimal target where you would like to go and a threshold value you do not want to go below. I think it's clear with 3 colors on this slide. Then we inventoried the existing approaches. We found that there are 4, mainly. One, that it's fixed value. Take values in the literature. Well, for example, in the soil monitoring law, it is this value of 2 tons per hectare of soil being eroded as being the threshold. All the soil organic carbon to clay ratio, 16 if I remember well. The advantages is that it's simple to implement and very simple to explain. The disadvantage is that you need to have good literature for that and the good references. And the good references and values and supporting scientific information at the proper spatial scale. All the discussion on this organic carbon to clay ratio is on that, using it in different pedoclimatic conditions. Then you can use a reference to an optimal situation. Well, in the USO dashboard, that is the case for the soil organic carbon. 80%, it is considered a limit is set as, I don't remember if it's 60 or 80% of the stocks under permanent mixedland. Again, that's quite easy to understand. The limit is that you may not have those references in the context, in the district or in the region you're analyzing. You may not have permanent grasslands. And what is the good threshold? 60, 70, 80? So this is, at some stage, you have to impose. And then this may not be understood by stakeholders. Distribution, that is using the distribution, the statistical distribution of the values of a given indicator in either the country or the district or the soil unit, whatever. You said that, for example, it's the lower quartile is unhealthy. One advantage is that it's very flexible. You can have it at different spatial scales easily. Disadvantage is that you need a lot of data, and you may have a bias if the whole region, as for example, is an intensive agricultural region for decades and centuries. Well, it will be based towards low values of some indicators. And then a fourth approach is relative change. The example was given by the 4 per mil initiative. You know, they used a global order of magnitude at the scale of our planet to propose 4 per mil variation of organic carbon stocks as a desirable target. Well, the discussion there has been shown that it's not always easy to understand, but to accept. But again, it's in a sense simple to implement. The limits, again, is which value, of course, and what to do with situations where you already are at an optimum. What do you do with pioneers? So what we did after work on these, based on the literature and on workshops, is that we developed 3 case studies: Jutland in Denmark, the Po Plain in Italy, and mainland France, where we applied the different methodologies. So I will not go into detail. So we set targets and thresholds. What you can see if you go for a column is that there are indeed differences in the surface area of the red, that is either below the target or below the threshold. In most cases, so it does influence the outcome. In most cases, the spatial distribution was more or less the same, which is reassuring. In one case, it was not. See here for France, the distribution method really pointed on soils in southern France, because in that case, when colleagues did it, they used the distribution of the whole data from France. And of course, in southern areas, the carbon content, it's about soil carbon content. The carbon content in average is lower. So it shows the necessity, again, to account for pedoclimatic context and to really think about the spatial distribution of your analysis, depending again on your data set. And what we did in here was to propose a framework to go through one of these methods. And essentially, the main reasons are the availability of soil information and the knowledge already developed for fixed values. And so we insisted on that, but it could also be acceptance. How easy is it to understand by stakeholders? Because we did that, I would say in general, we conceptually were targeting the soil monitoring proposal, but I think it can be done in many situations where you want to evaluate soil health. In many situations, either one of these methods is being used, and maybe placing them in such a framework would allow that different studies do not appear to contradict themselves. But it's logical that they have used this approach rather than this one because of their data availability, because of the context. For example, in Jutland, in the area, there was no permanent grassland. So in fact, the relative approach to an optimum was not good. We had to take a soil that had been only 5 years under grassland, not good reference. Okay, so sampling strategy, selection of indicators, setting targets and thresholds. And the last point I wanted to make is that it's really important that soil data becomes a common good. I think the 2 days were really with this idea. And we have develop a series of tools, a wiki with guidance on soil data provisioning options, a template for these are things I myself am not it's not at all my field. A geo package for soil data exchange. First, you can download everything and have access to everything on our website or using these QR codes, and a metadata catalog that is populated with data from our research projects, from our activities, and populated with, I think there are nearly 300 also national data sets. So the idea here is to make it more available to the community. And what is happening, and I'm very satisfied with it, is that this tool that we developed is being taken over by the SoilWise Mission Soil project that is further developing it, and then it will go into use. So this is a stepwise approach. And yes, you can search this document. And what we did to render the material accessible is that we developed, and we have version 2, one being accessible now on the website, an interactive PDF. So I didn't dare to do it here, but if you click on the topic or on you have the list of publications, the policy briefs, and some of the data sets already. So we made recommendations for this soil monitoring law. We know, in fact, the work was used. Our results are being used in the impact assessment. We know that at least in 12 countries, the national negotiation at the national level were based on data from our program. And we could see the changes, the progressive amendments. So it's very satisfying, yes, to see that. I think so I'm talking about policy, national level. But I think what is really important regarding monitoring soil health is to have in mind the objective. And the objective is not the same when you want to assess the effect of the practice you're implementing in your farm and when you want to know what is the status of the soils of your country. And some of the means that some of the indicators are not usable, the different levels. And this is not necessarily problematic. It has to be just transparent, explicit. For example, the visual assessment of soil structure would be, I think, extremely difficult to implement at the national scale. Too variable with time, not quantitative enough. Yes, our work showed the value at least for policymakers, of these systematic inventories of the state of affairs in different countries using published literature, but also great literature and direct access stakeholders holding the information. So this provides a baseline on which you can build, and baselines are necessary when you want to develop a new policy. And so it was working at the science, it is still working at the science to policy interface. What I can say is that it's extremely stimulating when you work in a scientific area and you see, oh, there's a law proposal. Oh, disagree, I agree. Why would they do that? But sustained. So it's extremely stimulating intellectually, drives you to make new assessment, to search, to discuss a lot. It is really a journey. It is a journey. And a few points that I want to emphasize in that is, first, it's dialogue is extremely important. And we found out that direct interactions with policymakers had a lot of value. And it was needed to build trust. And we could work together once we had developed trust. And I'm thinking someone this morning said that, yes, policymakers in their fancy offices, they are in their offices, not fancy that much. The ones I saw bought. My office is better. It's human relationships. like with farmers, not the same stakeholders, but trust is important. Capacity to understand each other, to develop what are our respective constraints. And this is extremely constructive. What we found out also is that an issue is that the timeline policy is not the timeline of research. When you're asking an assessment, the countries can have, oh, we need it for in 2 weeks. It's impossible. It should be a whole research project, 4 years, 5 years. Another point that is really important is how do we develop consensus? And the work on targets and thresholds I showed you, for me, was extremely important because a series of workshops, we progressively went to an idea, but we found that when organizing workshops that we could not present results like that. We had to have first stages of discussion of the results between scientists to identify what was most relevant and whether the different data presented were opposite or not. Maybe it's okay to present results that do not match, that are not in synergy, but there needs to be an analysis. And I'm often wondering whether our soil science community is enough invested in trying to develop consensus. Consensus doesn't mean that you agree on everything, but you agree on, I would say, the tier one of your discourse is there. And another point also is that for me, I think our community really need to work on how to communicate about complexity, go beyond, oh, it depends. That's not acceptable in France, but it depends on what. And communicate about uncertainty. This is extremely important and not that easy. And on this, I would like to thank you for your attention.